All right, well, let's get going here on our full month of June report. I am guessing that we are going to see a little bit lower attendance than normal just because we are hours away from folks celebrating the 4th of July holiday. All right, looking at the US charter trend, what I think is worth noting is that these days where the red, which is this year, are higher than last year. I mean, if we look earlier in the year where we kind of the red was materially below, we're now having days that are right up there. And the net of that is our distance from last year's numbers is improving. So the year to date average is 1.66 below last year. We're at 1.24, and July is looking better than June when it comes to that. I mean, granted, we're only 3 days in, but the first couple of days have been good. So positive news in that the trend is on. Trend is improving. If it keeps going like this, it wouldn't surprise me if in late July, August, we weren't ahead of last year for charter. Now, part of that is when we look at this, the numbers that we're trying to beat when we look at last year are lower than where we're at right here, right? So when we look at these yearly year-over-year bars, uh, the bar that we have to beat is fairly low. So it stands to reason that as long as things don't get materially worse, we should be sort of at or hopefully even a little bit better than last year. Certainly not materially less. So that's where we're at. When we look at Part 91 is still above last year versus behind last year, but it's slightly lower than the year-to-date average. So we're at 3% for the month compared to 3.1%. So that's a slightly weakening trend. But as you can see by the chart here, we're still in fairly strong positive territory. And you can see that here we're up 3.01%, while it was 3.31% for the month of May. So it's a slight decrease. It's almost indistinguishable, though, when you just look at the trend line. And then here is combined traffic. So when you add the better performance in charter and the nearly the same performance in Part 91 and 91K, then you're going to see a slight uptick, and we're up 1.8% year over year for the month of June. Now, when we look at our size classes here, no new trend. The light jets continue to be the size class, that's struggling, at least of all the jet categories. Mid-sized jets are doing better, but are still in negative territory. The super mids were off, they're not doing as well as they were earlier in the year when we were at 5.1%. We're up 0.3%. We're also into the softer season for them. In the summer, a lot of the flight legs are shorter, and folks are more likely to typically, select light jets. But clearly we haven't seen that as much this season. When we get into large cabin, that is where we're really seeing the growth, the strength in the market. Those large cabin flyers tend to be the most resilient. Once you started flying in heavy metal, you tend to stick to it, and we're seeing that here with 5.3% for the month of June compared to 4.7% for the year. So it's actually improving overall. A lot of that isn't new highs, but it's higher lows. So the lows that we saw in the past aren't there. And then turboprops did exceptionally well here and have made up a huge amount of ground, coming back to 0.7% below last year when they were off 9.7% for the year. So that's really an interesting thing to see right now. I haven't had a chance to really dig in and try and understand what might have changed there, but it's a very interesting change. Now, looking at our major metro markets, here is LA. You can see the traffic is up 1.7% month to date, and that's compared to 2.1% for the year. That's all traffic. Then we get to just GA, and we're up 11.3% versus 8.3%. I continue to believe that this is being driven at least in part by the runway construction going on at Van Nuys. And then here is Van Nuys off 6.9%. That is an improvement over the 11.9% year-to-date average, but it's still in negative territory. And again, I think runway construction has something to do with that. Here is LaGuardia. For anyone that isn't familiar, these lows here are Saturdays. The airlines pull back their traffic on US domestic airports. There, we're seeing no real material change. It's up 0.4%, but airline schedules there are pretty consistent. Here is Teterboro, where we're tracking 2% growth compared to 1.9% negative for the year to date. Now, a bunch of that 1.9% negative was when there was more turmoil around the air traffic situation there. So we took a hit there and have to kind of build back afterwards. But we are seeing that at this point, the traffic is back to normal or even slightly better. It's interesting that with Teterboro back to where it should be, White Plains is still stronger than ever, up 17.9%. Newark, on the other hand, is still down, and there really isn't a lot of business jet traffic into Newark. You go into Teterboro, not Newark. So we didn't break out just the BizAv, but you can see that the flight schedules dropped and they really haven't come back yet, even though the runway construction in Newark is behind us. So those scheduled flight reductions are kind of in there, at least for the near term. Farmingdale, though, is also facing, or not facing, but benefiting from similar, improvement. Like White Plains, it's up double digits, 18.3% against 12.5% for the year to date. And then here is Morristown also benefiting, up 11%. So the whole New York metro market is in positive territory, with the exception of Newark, as we pointed out. Then here is Chicago Midway, including airline traffic, off 4.7%. Better when we pull out the airlines, only off 0.9%, which is slightly below the 0.9% positive that we've got for the year to date. Then here's Chicago Exec. We had a dip there that resulted in a 1.3% drop for the month as a whole. This is significant enough that that event, likely triggered the deal for the month. And then here is Atlanta with the airlines, also had likely a weather event in there that impacted traffic. And when we yank out the airlines and just show GA, we are off just 0.5% compared to a 5% drop overall. So things kind of picked up in here. And it's interesting, we've seen this a few times where there's a real drop in the airline traffic and then a spike in private aircraft to make some sort of recovery in Hartsfield. Then here is Peachtree, and you can see we're up 2.1% and that compares to 3.5% for the year. So off slightly from the year-to-date trend, but still in positive territory. Jumping up to the Boston area, we are 1.3% ahead, including all the airline traffic. And you can see this market sort of paints a parabola when we look at the traffic. So we're coming into the summer surge. This dip right here is 4th of July, obviously. And then when we yank out the airline traffic, we're still in, not just still in positive territory, we're in much stronger positive territory, up 12.8% for the year, which is above the 8.1% trend. So very, very strong things going on in Boston. Here is Bedford, the suburban airport, out off the 128 belt, off 1% month to date, which is slightly better than the year-to-date trend. So it's just slightly weaker. Slightly different patterns this year than last. You can see the red lines are not even close to overlapping the gray lines from last year. So slightly different things going on out there. Here's Reagan, similar to LaGuardia. You're seeing these weekend dips, not quite to the same degree as LaGuardia. LaGuardia almost seems to shut down on Saturdays. We're tracking 0.8% below last year, so slight change in the airline traffic. When we bounce out to Dulles, this is all traffic, including the airlines and international. So you can see that we're up 15.5% month to date. That's just pretty amazing stuff for a major airline airport. It's thousands of additional flights. And then here is Dulles on a GA basis, up 11%. Several hundred additional flights in there. When we look at Manassas, also following this Washington, D.C. metro area spike, if you want to call it that, and it's up 16.1%, which is right in line with the year-to-date trend of 16.3%. So a lot of additional traffic in and out of the DC metro area. We then take a look at Charlotte, and Charlotte for all traffic is off about 4.5%. There were some huge bumps in airline schedules the first part of this year. It looks like some of that is tapering off for one reason or another. We then look at Charlotte GA, and it's up 3.3% with some really sort of dramatic spikes here of up to about 190 flights a day, which is a lot of GA traffic for Charlotte. And that 3.3% bump, it compares to 7.3% on the year-to-date, so it's a little slower than the year-to-date's trend, but still in positive territory. Now, bouncing over to popular summer destinations, here's West Hampton and the Hamptons. You can see we're 3% above last year, and that compares with 3.6% year-to-date. Definitely jumping into the summer season for the Hamptons. Then going out to ski country, we're seeing our summer peak out here. Let's just jump over to the GA because that's what really matters. And you can see that we are off a bit, off 6.8%, which takes the year-to-date trend down to dead even with last year. Then we look at Eagle right down the road, and we are off 4.5%, including the airlines, only off 2.5% when we pull those out. And that compares to a 3.1% bump on the year-to-date trend. So you can see that Colorado, for one reason or another, is slightly weaker this summer so far than last year. Looking at Denver, we are dead even with last year on a flight count for the month to date, and we're 2.3% up for the year-to-date on Centennial. Now heading back east to another one of these summer destinations, here is Nantucket with just GA traffic. You can see that we are up 21.7%. That's pretty significant. As a matter of fact, it's 1,000 flights more if you look at these numbers right here for the month of June year over year, which for a small island like Nantucket is pretty crazy. Martha's Vineyard, same deal. They don't, obviously not quite as many flights, really almost about half, and but still up 19.5% on a year-over-year basis. So strong beginning to the summer for the islands off the coast of Massachusetts. And then when we flip out to, I guess, leisure destinations on the West Coast, here is Napa. You can see we're up 0.1% compared to a -2% year-to-date trend. So we're above the trend, having fairly good traffic in June, but just kept keeping up with the year-to-date there. Then Bandon Dunes, another popular West Coast leisure destination, is up 0.4% compared to 6.7% year-to-date. So it's a little bit weaker than we've seen, but still in positive territory. Then we hop down to Scottsdale. And you can see we're at 9.2% for June with a nice little spike in here compared to 5.0 for the year-to-date. So Scottsdale, despite the heat, is having a pretty strong summer. And then here is Jackson Hole. Looks like they're almost at record-breaking territory here. That would very nice spike here to set 164 flights. Looks like was the peak in there. And that's up 3.7% on a month to date, or for the month of June compared to 8.4% year to date. So we're trending slightly lower than the year to date beat, but still, doing very, very well in Jackson Hole. And here is Hilton Head, that is having a whole host of new spikes this year that we didn't see last year. This spike here is their annual golf tournament. I think it's the Heritage Classic. But these spikes are new, and those are resulting in 21.1% uh, uh, improvement in the month of June and 6.4% for the year. So really this one is driven by these spikes right in here that are in June. Then when we look at our other cities, we go halfway across to Dallas and the Addison Airport there, which has also had a nice June with a big spike here. Of course, the numbers here reflect the fact that last year there was runway construction, and so they were really down on traffic. And then this year we're seeing a spike on top of that. So you put all that together, and you're looking at well over 1,000 more flights this month than the same time last year. That is not really following over to Dallas Love. Here is Dallas Love with the airlines, and you can see it's off 3.5%. When we just look at GA for Dallas Love, we're at minus 5.7. So not quite the same story over there. Then here is Opa-locka. Opa-locka is 6% above, so it's beating its year-to-date average, having a pretty strong June, but it's still the off season for Opa-locka. You can see that we're kind of in the slower season here for the next couple months. Then here's Fort Lauderdale International for all traffic, off off 7.8% when we look at that. Different story, still up 9.3% when we look at the current month. And just GA for Fort Lauderdale, that is less than a 22.3% year-to-date spike. And part of that is we're not seeing the presidential TFRs that we were. And you'll see more evidence of that when we get to West Palm. So here's Fort Lauderdale Exec, off 4%, so slightly weaker as they're also heading into the slower summer season. And it's 4% compared to a 1.5% drop on a year-to-date basis. So a little bit weaker there. Here's Naples when we bounce over to the West Coast for a moment, and up 5.1%, which is nearly on track with the 5.4% year-to-date trend. So this is pretty much following last year's patterns, and same deal. It's coming into the sort of summer slow season there. Here is West Palm Beach, all traffic also having this sort of summer dip. Only off 0.6% for the airlines compared to a 6.6% year to date. And then here is Palm Beach for GA, and you can see it's actually up year over year compared to negative 13.9. Well, the negative 13.9 was all of these big dips, which were presidential TFRs, and you can see we haven't had any of those recently. So that's helping. Then we look at Nassau in the Bahamas, and this is just GA. We're up 12.8% year over year. Looks like almost 300 flights. And that compares to 7.1% for the year to date. So that's a really nice, summer there on a year over year basis. Now let's fast forward to the most recent chart for the top 50 OD pairs. It's worth noting here, two markets that were up kind of across the board were Dulles with huge spikes there, and then New York Metro, which included Teterboro. And it's interesting, this is not typical. If we looked at prior years, to have the top OD pairs be Teterboro to Dulles would be uncommon, but that's where we're at right now. You can see that Las Vegas and Van Nuys, that oftentimes, I mean, when we look at the whole year, they're typically the top OD pairs, Las Vegas and Van Nuys going back and forth, and that's down to number 12 when we talk Van Nuys to Vegas, and it is number 26 when we go Vegas to Van Nuys going the other direction. So weaker demand there for whatever reason, and much stronger demand than we normally see between Dulles and Teterboro. Now, overall, the concentration is much lower than other parts of the year. In February, we will see 900 or more flights. Occasionally, we'll even break 1,000 flights in the top 50 OD pairs. Right now, all of these top 50 pairs are only adding up to 642 flights. That just means the flying that is happening in a less concentrated way. Now let's take a look at fuel. And you can see here was the last period, the first half of June, and things were decreasing just a little bit. When we go to this most recent week, it is a complete opposite. Everything is up virtually everywhere. I believe the biggest bump is Michigan at 38 cents a gallon, but everybody's in the like 20s to 30s when it comes to that, which is driven by the events in the Middle East. There was a period there where people were very concerned about the impact of Iraq and the campaign that Israel had there on oil price. It did drive oil prices up. I think that, we're likely to see that reverse itself in the next 2-week period as things catch up and whatnot. But at any rate, you can see that was one of the most dramatic increases in prices over a short period of time than we've seen in quite some time. And then no big surprises in terms of where things are most expensive. We've been on this call before. Alaska, Colorado, and Rhode Island do tend to be the most expensive spots, and that is still the case. So that is the last slide in the deck. If there's anybody that has, a question you'd like to bring up for the group of folks that we have here today, by all means, you can unmute yourself or put it in the chat. I do have the ability to pull up any other airport in the US if I didn't run through it, if you're curious what it is, and I can also go back and revisit any airport if I went by it too fast. So happy to do any of that. If you have any other curiosities, questions, anything you want to throw out, you can either unmute yourself or throw it in the chat.
Hey, Greg, it's Christy over at Cirrus Aviation.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. I'm looking for a little bit more detailed information on Houston. I mean, could we talk offline after the call? Would you have a few minutes to talk after
Sure, I'm
this
going to be
call?
jumping in my car, but why don't you shoot me your email, greg@tivoli.com. Shoot me your phone number, and I'll give you a call as soon as I get in the car.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
You bet. All right. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining. Hope you all have a wonderful 4th of July weekend, and we'll talk to you in a couple weeks with a look at first half of July. You bet, Kate. David, happy 4th. Take care. And Christy, talk to you in a minute. All right. Bye-bye.